Hello everybody, I'm still reading through my book, Lessons from Life. We're coming near to the end now. And this is the part where Jesus is talking about wolves in sheep's clothing. I spoke about it the last talk, and this is part 2. And we're still in Matthew chapter 7, verse 15. Beware, says Jesus. These false prophets are in the church. They're the ministers of the broad way. The last days are the days of deception, and these are the most deceptive people in the church. Ministers of Satan who've been transformed into ministers of righteousness. But you will always, without fail, know them by their fruit. Cain means possession. Cain slew his brother. Why is Cain an example of a false prophet? Because he chose to serve God in his own way, the way he wanted. He went on to build the first city, his own environment, where he could continue to do what he chose. False prophets today purpose the same thing. Serve God and please yourself. Balaam, who we read about in Numbers 22, was a prophet. He heard from God, but he was greedy for reward and wanted his reward more than he wanted the truth. Eventually, God gave him permission to go his own way, but God's anger was kindled because he went. That's in verse 22. God does the same today. He apparently blesses what the false prophets and the people do, but his anger is kindled. It's no coincidence that Balaam resurfaces in the letters to the churches about the last days. Balaam is back. In these examples, we see self operating against God in a spiritual disguise. They've shifted sides and become ministers of Satan. That's from 2 Corinthians 11, verse 15. They're the most deceptive and dangerous element in the kingdom today. That's scary, don't you think? But I think everyone has the potential characteristics of Cain, Balaam, and others such as Kor, which are the seeds of the false prophets. Morris talked about these people in his sermon that I've just read to you. Yet it's hard to detect what's in us without revelation, as we're all brilliant at justifying our actions, and we either come through and progress to a safer plateau, or else we justify what we're doing by making out that wrong is right. But as the Bible says in Proverbs 14, verse 12, there is a way which seems right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. I never imagined that I could have a career in singing when I was a child. It was way out of my reach. I saw people on the television and I imagined myself in their shoes, but my mum would say to me, they had to sleep with the director to get there, or they have to show their legs and body. Well, consequently, as I was chubby and had moral values, I realised that show business was out of bounds for me as a Christian. But it's amazing how we can substitute a church platform for a worldly stage. I've sung almost since the day I cut my teeth, as teachers at school noticed my obvious talent and both pushed and encouraged me into the public eye. But I was genuinely embarrassed about my size, and I hated standing in front of people dressed in my white shirt, my school tie and the pleated skirt, which was so unflattering. But the teachers made me feel as though I was letting the whole school down if I made a fuss. So I ended up singing solos for inter-house school festivals as well as school competitions, and more often than not coming away with first prize for these events. My public success at school helped me enormously to overcome my inferiority complex, and I realised that I really did have a God-given talent. I teamed up with a black girl at my church named Carolyn Miller, and we were kept busy with engagements, singing duets at various church conferences for a couple of years. Then at the age of 16, I joined a band in my church. Now this was different to anything I'd ever done before, as I now belong to a serious group of musicians who played as well as sang. We wrote our own material and took many bookings in the UK as well as abroad, and advertised with posters and handbills our availability to take engagements. And indeed, we were paid for our services. Because I was now working in an office during the day and involved with the band, who were all male except for me in my free time, I did something about my size and I slimmed down. This had a dramatic effect on me. Instead of covering up, as I had always done before, I now avidly followed fashion and showed off my assets. In some twisted way of thinking, I felt that my public had a right to this image. We began to go into recording studios and produce records and cassettes and make a name for ourselves. We had big plans and big ideas of what we wanted to do and where we wanted to go. The bookings we received were from various venues, but we particularly liked to go to large churches or concert halls because we were more likely to sell our albums, which helped tremendously to pay back the costs we'd initially laid out and also to buy better equipment. We'd often judge a church by the amount it paid us. If they were generous, they were praised, but if they were stingy, they were almost despised. The greedy way of Balaam was in our hearts right from the outset, and we didn't even recognise it. We wanted fame, recognition, and often even wondered about performing in clubs, singing Christian as well as the expected secular songs, of course. Our idea was that if we became famous, then the world would listen to our testimony and we would make an impact on society. But for some reason, or God, this never really materialised, as Maurice and I could never feel completely free in our consciences. But we brought as much of the world as we could into our act, without actually going there physically. We wrote music which we felt would be acceptable to non-Christians, had stage lighting and effects, moved about on the stage as much as we dared without being too provocative, and wore the most fashionable clothing. At one point, I even went as far as becoming anorexic. That's before God mercifully delivered me from this evil sickness, because I was so vain and concerned about my public image. Well, unfortunately, the guys, one by one, left for various reasons, and Maurice and I ended up on our own with his youngest sister, who'd recently joined us. His other sister and her boyfriend joined too, and the group now entertained with drama as well as music. I must admit, I enjoyed what we did immensely. It was great fun. We did lots of witty, comical sketches, which I threw myself wholeheartedly into, revelling in the laughter and appreciation of the congregations we performed before. It was so rewarding to have an audience to display our talents before, and it really did feed our egos. But only on the dramatic performance of the crucifixion did I ever feel the presence and awe of God. It didn't take long before this group disintegrated too, and Maurice and I were left completely on our own. But we still recorded and travelled with his father, who was an international evangelist, until he retired, and then we were entirely alone. Nevertheless, we weren't daunted, and we pursued what we believed God had called us to. All this time, we were very serious about God and believed with all our hearts that we were doing His will, serving Him in spirit and in truth. We even came to the place where we could see our own greed for success, and we felt that we had to do something to prove to God and ourselves that we were not in this ministry to make money. We genuinely wanted to minister. So we agreed that wherever we performed, we'd give our albums away free of charge and trust God to provide for all our needs. This sounded great and very noble in theory, but it proved to be a disaster, as young kids would be snapping them up and the older, more serious and responsible people were too embarrassed to ask for free goods. And then there was the problem that people thought that if we were not selling our albums, then they must be of very inferior quality. We couldn't win. So we couldn't get our ministry out. It was then that we hit on the idea of selling our albums as cheaply as possible, stipulating that all our material was non-copyright and to give them away whenever we felt led to. This has worked well ever since, and God has miraculously looked after us financially for, over 30 years. But there came a day when, quite surprisingly, God told me to give up everything I was doing in the church. This, I didn't want to do, as it was my life. But I did know God's voice when he spoke, and he left me in no doubt that he'd spoken to me, so I did what he told me to do. And then something wonderful happened. One Sunday morning after the service, a black lady, Ida Mills, she's dead now, she'd been a member of the church for years, and she asked me why I was no longer singing or playing the organ during the meetings. I abruptly said that God had told me not to. I expected that she would be shocked, but it was me that got the shock, because she told me that God had given her a vision concerning me. She said I'd been in the limelight for too long and had become proud and arrogant. I had to be knocked off my pedestal and humbled before God could use me properly. You know, under normal circumstances, this sort of insult would have made me really angry. But then she went on to say that she'd been fasting and praying for me. Wow. Talk about speaking the truth in love. I accepted what she said without any nasty thoughts or feelings, because up to this point, nobody had ever said that they loved or cared about me enough to fast for me. Well, once I was off the platform, it wasn't long before I was out of the church as the whole situation turned itself around on me. Because there had been no public announcement from the pastor that I was resigning from my position in the church, people imagined that I'd stopped ministering because I was under church discipline for some misconduct. The truth was that the pastor had told me that he didn't accept my resignation. This was my job in the church, and I could take it back up again whenever I wanted to. But the criticism and rumours which went around the church were so hard to cope with that I ended up leaving altogether. Up until then, this was the lowest point I had ever reached in my Christian walk. Nothing before had ever matched up to this trial. I didn't want to know those who call themselves Christians, as I thought they were all tarred with the same brush. Love you when you were in favour, and ignorantly judge and accuse you when you drop out of the limelight. But I've also come to recognise this period as one of the greatest blessings I've ever received from the hand of God, because it was now just me and him. And I had to find him on my own without any props of church or ministry. I had to accept the fact that for all those years God had used me, but now he was putting me on the shelf because I'd served my purpose. It was now time for him to use others. There's a saying, every dog has its day. I was 30 years old, and maybe God now considered me past it. The pain of rejection began to ease, as after a while I found another church and once again began to build up my relationship with God and other Christians. I found a job, threw myself into that with vigour and enthusiasm. Then out of the blue, 3 years after God telling me to put everything down, the minister of the church I was attending found out that I was a singer and asked me to sing during one of the meetings. The minister was so pleased with my ministry that he asked me to do a concert. Well, the very first song that I sang during this concert revealed in a dramatic way the difference between performing and ministering. I'd never sung like this before. As I sang the opening bars of my first song, the people, they just disappeared from my view, and I was transported in my spirit to heaven. I looked into the very face of God as I sang, "Oh, how I love thy law," from Psalm 119, and I knew I was singing for God's ears and not for the people's. This was what God had wanted all the time, my spirit to be wrapped up in his as I sang for his pleasure. For all those previous years, I'd been conscious of the people and of where my voice could get me. It was the fruit of my labours like Cain's, but not what God had wanted and was therefore unacceptable. The Bible says that those who worship God must worship him in spirit and in truth. Years ago, Morris taught jazz improvisation, and hoping to educate me in music, took me to a concert performed by Stefan Grappelli, the famous jazz violinist. At the end of the show, and that's all it really was, an opportunity to show off his talent, Stefan stood on the stage and for ages, whilst people applauded and whistled, shouting for encores. As he bowed time after time after time, each time he lifted his head, I could sense him soaking up all the praise and the adulation. And my spirit squirmed as I realised he was taking to himself something which belongs only to God. In fact, he was making himself out to be a god, and that's a very dangerous thing to do. When King Herod accepted praise from the people after giving a speech, which sounded as though it had been spoken by a god, he was struck with worms and died. You can read that in Acts 12, 21 to 23. Power and praise is dangerous because it appeals to pride, and lust for power exists in most men's hearts. We can read in Numbers 16 how it drove Korah to rebellion, which is a fruit of the false prophets. We must never take to ourselves what rightfully belongs to God. After witnessing personally what was really going on with Stefan Grappelli at that concert, I determined never to accept applause or praises when singing in churches. My aim had to be to sing for God's pleasure, and I must never be praised for doing that. It was my duty and my privilege. Sometimes people have said that they were applauding God when they clapped me, but maybe so. But you'd be amazed at how the applause affects a performer. It feeds pride and ego. And if you really cared for the spiritual welfare of the person on the platform, you'd do better to show your appreciation to God in another way. I'll leave you to think about that one. God bless you.